Christian from 350 people. Thank you. You're a good man.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Anne, for that wonderful introduction. I have to tell you, I am really thrilled this morning to have this discussion with two leaders, patriots, who really have served our country with distinction, honor, courage of conviction, compassion, and integrity. And I have to say that not only did they serve our country in their formal capacities, but they continue to serve our country. So we have a lot of issues to go to and to discuss about leadership and about foreign policy and strategy. And I want to...
let me just say that after that introduction, we're thrilled you're the moderator.
Indeed, indeed.
Checks in the mail.
Yeah.
I want to go first to the issue of America's role in the world.
Okay.
And you know, but let me preface it, if I may, by saying, you know, it was Winston Churchill who delivered a very significant address up at Harvard in 1943. And in that address, he talked about America's role in the world. And he particularly said the following. He said, "The price of greatness is responsibility." President Bush, how do you see America's role in the world today?
Well, yeah, thank you. First of all, Gates is old enough to have been at the speech. And I'm proud to be on the stage with both you and Bob. Bob was, so you should judge your president by the company he keeps. And I had a fabulous cabinet, and Bob Gates was an integral part of the team. And I want to thank you for your continued service. So, America, we stand for human decency, human rights, the rule of law, free press, free religion. It's ingrained in our soul. And I think it's in our interest that others practice an open civil society for the sake of peace. One of the lessons of 9/11 is that how others live matters to our national security. A message that seems to be getting lost on the American people as that moment recedes in our collective memory. I believe it's in our national interest and self-interest that others live in free societies, and therefore America's role in the world it's got to be to hear the voices of those who are imprisoned, to hear those that scream for religious freedom, those that want there to be a vibrant press, to hold the powerful to account. And if we're not willing to listen and engage, then it's unlikely that others will embrace the habits necessary for peaceful societies.
Thank you. Your freedom agenda certainly underscores that, both when you were president and now here at the Bush Center.
Yeah, you're right.
I like that answer. Secretary Gates, how do you see it?
Well, very similarly, the way I would put it is I'm very much an American exceptionalist. I realize that's old-fashioned, but I believe that Lincoln was right when he said that we are Earth's last best hope. And in a time of rising authoritarianism, to borrow from Isaiah, I think it's important that America be a light unto the nations. As the defender of human rights, democracy, liberty, and human dignity, there's nobody else left. It's just us. And if we don't stand for those ideals, and we're deeply flawed, we have a lot of flaws, but the world has always looked to America for this kind of leadership despite those faults, because we're unique, I think, in that we're always trying to overcome them and work at them. On a more practical level, I think the United States is the only significant force in the world for an international rules-based order, where it isn't dog eat dog and every nation out for itself, but trying to figure out how we get along, how we work together to address a variety of problems. And if the United States doesn't lead, there is no one else to lead. If you look at other democracies, and some of them, like our best friends, the British, are in even more trouble than we are. So I think that we have a unique role in the world, and as the president said, it's in our own interest to play that role in the world. Just one final historical thought. The notion that we can seal ourselves off from this responsibility, I think, is very naive. I mean, who would have thought that the assassination of some Austrian archduke in 1914 would have an effect on us, or the German seizure of a little piece of land from Czechoslovakia in 1938, or a bunch of ragtag terrorists living in Afghanistan in 2001. So the notion that we can ignore the rest of the world and just do our own thing, I think, is downright ignorant.
Yeah, can I tell one story? So on September the 12th, 2001, Koizumi calls me. He was the Japanese prime minister, and he said, the United States and Japan will stand shoulder to shoulder to enhance our mutual security, and we will work to spread freedom as the alternative to the ideology of the murderers. It was a remarkable conversation because 60 years prior to that, my dad chooses not to go to college, but to go to fight the Japanese. And she got asked what happened. I bet in the late 40s, if somebody said, one day Japan and the United States will stand shoulder to shoulder to enhance our mutual security, they would have said, you're a hopeless, idealistic person, naive. And yet it happened. And one reason it happened is because there's a universality to freedom. People want to be free. It doesn't matter whether you're a Methodist or a Muslim. They want to be free. And the Japanese adopts a Japanese-style democracy. And an enemy became an ally for the sake of peace. And the question Americans must ask themselves, can it happen again? It's happened throughout history. Can it happen again? And I believe our collective answer is absolutely, unless the United States says it's none of our business how others live.
Let's talk about Iraq.
Okay.
President Bush, you know.
Thank you.
Oh, this is significant. In your book, Decision Points, you said that the most important part of your job as president was making decisions, and Chapter 12 was on the surge. That truly was a difficult decision, but it was a wise decision. It certainly was a decision not to pull out troops out of Iraq, but instead to enhance it.
That's right.
Explain it.
Because I thought we could achieve the goal of a functioning democracy in the Middle East and an ally in the war against terror. And I had great faith in our military to help us achieve that goal. And I felt that a withdrawal during a difficult period of time in Iraq would have emboldened an enemy that still was a threat, in my judgment, to our homeland, and would have dispirited our military, particularly the families. In other words, it would have looked like the initial decision was a pure political decision, and that would have been a political decision. But I couldn't stomach the idea of people saying, well, George W. is trying to save his own political skin by making a strategic decision that would have weakened our standing in the Middle East and weakened the faith in others that we stood for free societies. Remember, the Iraqis had voted for a new constitution and had voted for a government. And it worked. And one reason it worked is because the Secretary of Defense, Gates, helped make it work. And so Bob came on right as the surge hadn't even been announced. And I remember meeting with you in Crawford, and he slid over from Texas A&M. He was running the mighty A&M university, and we talked about the surge, and he was committed to making sure that America did not retreat from the battlefield again. And yeah, thank you for, yeah, it was the right decision, and it worked.
Well, it was a significant part of your book and also
yeah,
your presidency.
A chapter.
Secretary Gates, you implemented it. Tell us about the trials and tribulations.
It was not only a wise decision, it was a courageous decision, because what perhaps a lot of people don't know is most of the senior military didn't agree. There were a handful who did, but most of the most people did not think it was a good idea. Just a few points about the surge. First of all, I remember the president saying, you know, we're going to need a new commander. And he said, you might want to take a look at this General Petraeus. And my mom didn't raise an idiot. I looked at General Petraeus, and I ran a few traps, and I came back to the president, and I said, gee, Mr. President, I think David Petraeus would be exactly the right guy for this job. So the president approved 6 brigades going in. So that was about 20,000 troops. And a few days after he'd made that decision and authorized it, senior military leaders came in to me and said, we really made a kind of a serious mistake. We forgot about the enablers. I'd never heard this word before, the enablers. Well, it's the helicopters, it's the medevac, it's the logistics, it's the field hospitals, it's all that stuff. So all of a sudden, a surge of 20,000 became 30,000. Now, just to give you a little flavor in terms of cost, on average, for every 1,000 soldiers you send overseas, it costs $1 billion, okay? So I'm just going back to him, telling him the cost of this thing, both in men and money, is going to be about 50% higher than originally. So I told the military, I said, okay, I will take my head in my hands and go tell the president what we need to do, but don't you ever do that again. Don't ever forget about the enablers. The second problem was finding enough troops, and this was the hardest decision I think I made as secretary, because the Army came to me and said, we don't have enough troops with the current deployment rates that we have. So we're either going to have to cut soldiers' time at home, or we're going to have to extend their tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. So instead of a year, it would be 15 months. And a young major working for me said, you need to understand, sir, you're breaking the rule of 2s, because now these soldiers are going to miss 2 birthdays, 2 anniversaries, 2 Christmases, 2 Thanksgivings, and so on. And it was the hardest decision because I knew how hard this was going to be on the troops and their families. The final point that I would make is that the Democrats in Congress were dead set against the surge, and having just taken control of the Congress, devoted every waking hour to make us reverse it as fast as possible. And so all through the first 6 or 7 months of 2007, we were fighting a constant rearguard action to prevent the Congress from making us bring the troops home before most of them had even gotten there. And during the spring, after consulting with the president, I told Petraeus, and then made it public, that I had asked for a report on progress in September, because I felt like if we got to summer, then I could tell it was important for us to hold the Republicans, especially in the Senate. And if we could get to summer, I could then tell those Republican senators, oh, for heaven's sake, at least give us until September. It's only 8-10 weeks from now, to see whether this thing is working. And the good news was we already had signs by May the surge was working, and that it was having the effect that we had hoped. But it was a tough slog all the way. And as I say, put a huge burden on our troops and their families. But we also had a battlefield in Iraq, but we also had a battlefield in Washington.
Yeah, that's right. One thing I'd like to note is one of the reasons why ultimately the Pentagon agreed was because Pete Pace did a fabulous job of shepherding the military. I know Pete's here. He was the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs from the Marine Corps. No wonder we were successful.
And he was my tutor. He taught me a lot in the first,
Pete was awesome.
First time I was secretary.
Yeah, by the way, he's now on the board of the Bush Institute. Yeah.
Well, your leadership on that issue, respectively, both of you, is truly exemplary. Another area where your leadership was also exemplary was certainly with regard to Afghanistan. Both of you were very vested in Afghanistan and ensuring that al-Qaeda's safe haven was not only obliterated, but you worked to ensure that it wouldn't come back. Talk about some of the profound decisions you had to make in that regard.
Well, the first decision was after 9/11, I recognized this was a different kind of conflict as opposed to previous ideological conflicts where there was a capital and a standing army and an air force and spies. We were dealing with an enemy that could only thrive if they found the soft underbelly of failed states. Therefore, part of the doctrine had to be, in order to protect the homeland, if you harbor a terrorist, you're equally as guilty as the terrorists. And in this case, the Taliban was harboring al-Qaeda. And we gave them a chance to turn them in, but they wouldn't do it. And so when the president says something, he's got to mean it, and I meant it. And so the initial objective was to destroy al-Qaeda and its safe haven. And we did, thanks to not only the military, but the CIA. And it was an extraordinary effort. The interesting thing is, I recall, is Tommy Franks had trouble getting the troops in, and the American people started getting real anxious about, when are you going to do something? When are you going to do something? But there was like a fog in Uzbekistan, and it prevented the helicopters from flying, and then there was something, and this and that. But once we finally got going, the mission was partially accomplished. Then the question is, what is the role of the United States? Look, again, I understand Americans are tired and they're becoming isolationists. And so what I tell people is, if you want Afghan girls to suffer like they did prior to the liberation of the country, then convince the Congress to and the president to withdraw the troops. In my judgment, it would be not in our national interest to do that, particularly since we're a nation that believes in human dignity and human rights.
Absolutely. Mr. Secretary?
Well, most of the tough decisions that I had to make about Afghanistan, frankly, were in the Obama administration. We did have a problem when I first became secretary. The Taliban had fled to Pakistan and had used the years since we had ejected them to regroup and rearm with the help of the Pakistanis, and they really came back to try and change the events of 2001. We first saw that really in 2005, but by 2007 they were coming back pretty strong. So we tried to find more forces that we could, I just described how scarce combat forces were, but we found a couple of more brigades that we could put in 2007 to try and deal with this recurring Taliban threat. The two toughest decisions I had to make first in 2009 was the decision to relieve the commander in Afghanistan. He was a fine general. He'd had a great career, but he was not the right fit for the kind of war we were fighting in Afghanistan, and that's a very tough decision. It was also the first field commander that had been relieved since Truman fired MacArthur in the early 1950s. The second was persuading the president that we frankly, at the end of 2009, needed a surge in Afghanistan, similar to the surge that we had had in Iraq. The commander had asked for 40,000, Stan McChrystal had asked for 40,000 troops. And we debated this for 3 months in the Situation Room, and we finally got an agreement. The president agreed to send 30,000 additional troops, and then we put the arm on our allies for another 7,000 or 8,000. So we came very close to what the commander had asked for. Unfortunately, the benefits, and they did have significant benefits because these additional forces were able to clear out both Helmand and Kandahar provinces pretty well. But we were kind of fighting with one arm tied behind us because the president also had put a deadline for when we were going to leave. And one of the things that President Bush and Condi Rice and I all felt very strongly about, particularly in the time of the surge in Iraq, was no deadlines in terms of when we would begin to end the surge or when we would come out of Iraq. Because you basically then just tell the enemy, all you have to do is wait us out. And that was part of the problem, I think, in 2009, is when a firm date was established for pulling the troops out, it basically sent the message to the Taliban that no matter how much we suffer over the next few years, we got this thing. If we can just hang in there, we've got this thing.
What about the ongoing negotiations with the Taliban that are taking now? Do you have a view on that?
We know the guy who's negotiating on behalf of the U.S., Zal Khalilzad, who is, close to my administration. He's a good guy. Bob and I were chuckling because the Afghans are constantly accusing Zal of wanting to be the president of Afghanistan, which is not like the best position in the world for Zal to be aiming for. But Bob knows a lot more about it than I do. All I know is Afghanistan's got a democratically elected government that at some point in time need to be a part of any process in order for it to work.
Yeah, I would say that it's really, I mean, I think Zal is a very good negotiator. He was a very good ambassador. He knows the Afghans well. He's Afghan himself. And which is why they worry he wants to run for president. Although how anyone would think that was a career-enhancing move, I'm not quite sure. But I think that the key here is really sequencing. I don't have any issues with trying to sort out the main issues between the U.S. and the Taliban as the first step. But as any part of a negotiated outcome, the Afghan government is going to have to be a part of the process. And if we can get some basic issues sorted out between the U.S. and the Taliban, and then bring the Afghan government into those conversations, because at the end of the day, we can't walk away from those people, and they have to be part of the solution. We can't just do this over their heads and pretend that it's going to have any good impact long term.
Yeah, the other point I want to make about both countries is that it's just not the United States who's there. There was like 32 nations in the coalition of the willing in Afghanistan, I think 34 in Iraq. In other words, NATO is very proud of its decision to join with us in Afghanistan. And so there are other nations there. And we ought to be grateful as a nation that they're willing to do that.
Mr. President, this one is just for you on Afghanistan. I have to ask this. I have to put this forward.
Okay, well, go ahead.
And that is that First Lady Laura Bush made history during your administration when she delivered that weekly radio address on Afghanistan, which was the first time ever that a First Lady had done so. Yeah. And she said on that radio address, "The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women." She made 3 trips there. She's the honorary chair of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council. I mean, she's been committed to this. And this is about global citizenship. Isn't this a perfect example of that?
Yeah, it is. Well, I was trying to give a radio address. I'm sitting there all poised to speak, and I felt this sharp elbow in my side. Move over, Buster. And, no, it was, I think it was, Laura knew she could be impactful as the First Lady, and she learned firsthand how impactful she could be. Because after her speech, a lot of people wanted to be engaged in helping Afghan women and Afghan girls, and she gave great hope to people whose rights had been squashed by the Taliban. And it was a defining moment in helping to define how our administration would treat people around the world. And yeah, it was a good one.
Well, and she certainly has made a tremendous difference, not only then, but even now.
Yeah, she's still telling me what to do.
That may be a good thing.
Yeah, probably
Should I
is.
say?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyhow, Russia. We have to discuss Russia. Mr. President, I was struck by the fact that you've met Vladimir Putin more than 40 times during your administration. Who is he? What are his goals and objectives? Tell us.
We became so familiar with each other, I called him Vlad, and he called me W. He changed when I was president. When I first got elected, Russia was broke. Then the price of oil goes up, and the real Putin starts to emerge. I think Putin's main goal is to reinstate Soviet hegemony, Soviet glory. He's playing a pretty weak hand right now because the demographics of Russia are disastrous. He has consolidated power He is not much pushback. You know, people say, man, he's popular. And I said, yeah, I'd have been popular if we owned NBC News too. Anyway, he is zero-sum thinker. He's not a very good strategic thinker. Strategic thinkers think, what can we both do together to win? He thinks, what can I do to diminish America? Bob, I think I'm right about saying this, Bob, is that an old playbook out of the Soviet era was to try to foment dissent in our democracy by funding radical groups and create consternation in our society. For a period of time, the Soviet playbook was closed. All of a sudden, it seems to be reemerging. And we've got to make two things abundantly clear. One, our alliances are solid. I mean, imagine being a Lithuanian and worried about the U.S. engagement through NATO in protecting them through Article 5, and yet there's a lot of Russian speakers in Lithuania. And so our allies are being pressured by Putin, and they've got to know they've got a strong ally in the United States. And secondly, Putin's got to know he can't mess with our elections, that any attempt to dispirit the United States democracy, there's got to be significant pushback. And there needs to be a firm resolve by any administration to make it clear to Putin that we understand your game and you're not going to get away with it.
Mr. Secretary, by the way, before you give your response, I have to say you've done extensive academic work, Russian history, and looking at Soviet foreign policy. I've been a reader of many of your writings, both outside and then also when you served at the agency.
Wow.
So give us yours. No,
is that a sleeping device?
No comment.
It's the non-technical cure for apnea. I think to understand where Putin is coming from, you have to go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think we in the West greatly underestimated the magnitude of the humiliation, because it wasn't just the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. It was the collapse of a 4-century-old Russian empire. And so Russia's borders today, just kind of wrap your head around this, Russia's borders today are what they were before Catherine the Great became empress in the 18th century. Moscow used to rule 300 million people. Now it's 140 million. And declining. And then you had, during the 90s, a period of extraordinary destitution and chaos, disorder, criminal activity, murders in the streets, gangs killing each other, businessmen killing each other, and so on. So this, first of all, fed the need, which is, frankly, I think, part of the Russian culture for a strong leader, to restore order, to restore the economy, and so on. I think, and that's the backdrop against which Putin became president. I think he, from the very beginning, has had two basic goals. The first, as the president said, is to restore Russia to the Soviet Union's place as a great power and a power that has to be taken into account in dealing with any problems around the world. And I think their involvement in Syria, their involvement in Venezuela, their involvement in Africa, this is all basically a reassertion, we're back and don't mess with us, and you got to take us into account. The second is a strategy as old as the Russian Empire, and that is to create a buffer of either client states or frozen conflicts on their periphery. And we saw that in Georgia, we saw it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Moldova, and Transnistria. Frankly, I think if the Baltic states were not members of NATO, we would be seeing it, as the President suggested with Lithuania, I think we'd be seeing it in the Baltic states today. I think since the election of 2012, in which he felt or believed that the U.S. intervened against him when he was reelected president. And he regards anything that we were doing in terms of promotion of democracy, of civil society, and so on, which was going on, began really during the Bush administration, as interference in their internal affairs. And so I think this newest piece is basically retaliation and the determination to weaken the West in every way possible through fomenting internal divisions, and not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. And we've seen it in Germany, in France, in Italy. They were involved, I think, originally in the Brexit vote. And to the President's point about the Soviet playbook, the problem today is the technologies that are available through social media and the internet and cyber and so on are dramatically more effective than the tools that were available to CIA and the KGB back in the Cold War. And Putin is using all of these against us to try and foment divisions among us, to interfere with the outcome of our elections and so on. So, and I think we're going to be dealing with him for a very long time. His current term is not up until 2024. I think he will find a way to become, like President Xi, president for life.
It's one of the most serious challenges we have before us, certainly. Last month, there were 49 immigrants who were sworn in as U.S. citizens here at the Bush Center, and you and Mrs. Bush made remarks about the significant contributions of immigrants to our society. But you know, at the same time, you also noted that the center is very clear-eyed about the need to enforce our borders and protect our homeland. Talk about this issue.
Well, first of all, if you've never been to a naturalization ceremony, I urge you to go to one. They are spectacular moments of the greatness of America. People who've taken big risks to come here, people who've started their own businesses, people who want their kids to be able to get a good education, and they've stood in line and they've become citizens, and it is a spectacular moment. We had one, we've had two. The first one, I still had a little bit of the presidency in me and knew the photograph that would be broadcast across the country. So I had two Mexican-American in Marine uniforms who had just gotten sworn in on my sides. And I was sending a message to the American people that there's a pretty harsh debate right now, but please don't overlook the contributions of immigrants to the vibrancy of our soul. And so, yeah, it is nothing's going to get solved until the politics gets out of it. To me, it's viewed as a political plus for both parties in Congress. And it's sad because the problem's fixable. The laws need to be rewritten. The asylum laws need to be reinvestigated. The Border Patrol needs to be bolstered. And most Americans understand the need to enforce the border, but most Americans are more welcoming than the rhetoric has been thus far. And so, yeah, I'm a little discouraged about it. As you know, I heroically tried and miserably failed to get a bill passed in 2007. I still think it's the right model. I know there's not only a human rights dimension to this issue, but there's an economic dimension to this issue. And I think those of us who live in, or anywhere for that matter, know that many jobs that require hard work and, sweating away in August in Texas, Americans won't want to do them, but there are others who will. And so for the economic vitality of our country, we ought to have a rational worker program. And anyway, it's a tough issue, and it's, it really kind of, it clouds what's been so great about us as a nation, that we're able to assimilate. And I hope that the issue is just political, not a lack of confidence in what we stand for, and the ability of people to meld together.
Secretary Gates, what's the proper role of the military in this issue?
Well, I think that if first of all, when I became secretary, we had several thousand National Guard troops along the border. I actually was kind of cynical about it and had these discussions with President Bush. These troops were there at the request of the governors, and the reason they wanted the federal government involved was frankly because then we pay for those troops being on the border rather than the governors having to find the money to pay for them. I think that the military can provide short-term assistance where there are civilian shortfalls, whether it's in reconnaissance or logistics, things like that. But I think it should be considered short-term. It is not the mission of the American military to be on the border, to guard our borders. That's why we have the Customs and Border Patrol. And so where the military is filling a role, we ought to be strengthening the civilian agencies that are responsible for this long-term. So I think if the military is needed, I think that they have to play that limited role. They can't do law enforcement. They can't arrest people. In most cases, they don't even carry weapons. And so this is really about providing some kinds of support to fulfill short-term civilian deficiencies in capability. But it takes them away from their training. It takes them away from getting ready for the missions that they're actually supposed to be prepared to fight. So I see it as a short-term fix, not as a long-term role. That's not what the American military is supposed to do.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And by the way, we don't want to militarize our border, and we don't want to send a signal to Mexico that they're an enemy. Mexico is not an enemy. They're an ally. And anyway, fine answer, Secretary.
Another area that both of you have spent time on, China. China's cast as a strategic competitor. It's also been condemned for its predatory commercial behavior on behalf of both Republicans and Democrats, and there's been a call for strong action against China. What's the right balance for dealing with China?
Well, I think you just described it. On the one hand, there are benefits to trade. On the other hand, that China needs to be held account when they steal intellectual property, and hopefully the negotiations that are going on will achieve this objective. What's changed since I was there and Bob was there is Xi Jinping. They used to have a standing committee would make the decisions. So there'd be 7 people that required consensus amongst the 7, which was kind of a check and balance in an unusual way. And therefore, China seemed to be a lot risk-adverse at being confrontational. And then Xi Jinping, maybe president for life, has consolidated power, which changes the decision-making dynamic and changes the diplomacy. I believe the United States, though, must make sure that our allies, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and India, know that we stand squarely with them if China tries to encroach upon their territories. I happen to believe that not joining the Trade-Pacific, whatever it's called, trading partnership, something like that, was a mistake, because by pulling out of it, it sent a signal to our allies that we weren't serious about economic alliances, and that it also enabled China to gain a better market share from our allies relative to what we had. And so, you know, the best policy ought to be to negotiate the best deal we can get and negotiate trade disputes through world mechanisms and strengthen our bilateral alliances. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a reaction?
So really just to pile on to the president's comments about the role of Xi Jinping. The creator of Chinese reform, Deng Xiaoping, had an expression, hide your capabilities, bide your time. It's basically lie low while you're getting stronger. And he also, the second pillar of his approach was to prevent the rise of another Mao ever again. And so the structures that he created, term limits for the president, age limits for the members of the Standing Politburo and others, were intended to prevent that from happening. And it was sustained up until Xi came along. In the first case, what Xi has done is kind of basically go out there and say, hey, we've got an alternative model of governance and of the way countries ought to be organized, and our authoritarian state capitalism is the way to go. And you see these democracies are all paralyzed and can't get anything done, but look at us. And so he goes out and he brags about what they're going to do in technologies in 2025 and China 2050 and asserting China's military role in the South China Sea and things like that. that have, frankly, alarmed almost everybody. And the second piece of it was getting rid of all of those limits that Deng put in terms of leadership, making himself president for life. This basically destroys the notion of collective leadership, and frankly, it means he's totally responsible for everything that happens, in addition to having all the authority. But the problem with that is there's nobody going to come up to him and say, you're headed down the wrong path. You're making a mistake. And when a leader doesn't have anybody whispering in his ear, this is a mistake, or this is the wrong thing to do. And this was one of the safeguards of the collective leadership approach to decision making. It didn't stop the reform from going on, but it made sure that things were held in check, if you will. So I think what has happened and what's changed since we were in government is that you now have the business community as well as other countries, the business community in this country as in other countries, all increasingly concerned about China's approach and, frankly, a new attitude toward China after 40 years. And the key, I think, for us and for our leadership is figuring out, I think we have a long-term competition with China ahead of us. In many respects, it will resemble the Cold War. But we have to make sure to try and channel it into competition and avoid becoming adversaries, and with the risk of military confrontation. And that's going to take some pretty adroit leadership, both in Beijing and in Washington.
I got 2 points.
Okay.
One, that's the reason why it's important for Canada and Mexico and the United States to find common ground to bolster our respective economies so that we can better compete with China in the long term. And secondly, China has got enormous demographic difficulties as well. Remember, they had the one-child policy. Well, it turns out that most families that had one child wanted it to be a male. And so you've got an aging population, a declining population, and a lot of men, and very few women, relatively speaking. And so I don't think China's to be feared, because I believe our future is much brighter than theirs. But I do believe, as Bob said, that we can wisely exploit the consternation that's now rising around the world of China's aggressive policy.
We're at the end of our session, but I want to stick in a fast one because there's breaking news about the arrest of Julian Assange. Can you give a quick reaction?
Yeah,
Do either of you have a quick reaction to that?
2 words, about time.
Yeah, I don't have any sympathy for the guy either.
All right, I thought it would be a quick reaction, so I felt safe. And Eleanor Roosevelt
Snowden's next.
Yeah.
I wanted to close by saying Eleanor Roosevelt said, "He who is not courageous enough to take risks will accomplish nothing in life." Clearly, the two of you have taken a lot of risks in the positions in which you've held, but these risks have really benefited the lives of so many. Please join me in thanking both the President and Secretary Gates. To the video screen. Thank you.
Mount Kilimanjaro is the highest freestanding mountain in the world. It's the height of 13 Empire State Buildings, and I'm going to climb it. My name is Mariz. I live in Egypt. I love anything related to physical activities. It's what I'm good at and my passion. But it's not common for women to be athletes in Egypt, and I wanted to change that and take a stand. Climbing Kilimanjaro has always been a dream to me, but it's more than just climbing a mountain. It's a statement to make a difference. Some of the things that we do advise people to just be aware of is that you should expect to get a headache, feel a bit nauseous, lose your appetite, you might feel a bit dizzy, but that is okay.
So beautiful and green.
It's kind of scary, we're nervous, we're excited, and we cannot wait to see how it's like. In my home country, women are labeled. We have a lot of misconceptions. I wanted to make some noise about that. Having my passion as sports and running, it opened a lot of doors that I never expected. In running, if you push yourself, you're gonna reach the finish line anyway. But in the mountain, if you push yourself, you could risk your life. The mountain is the one that decides either you're gonna make it or not. It's day 5. It's the summit night. The guide gathered us and he was like, okay guys, this is the most dangerous part. At any point, if I tell anyone that you have to go down now, you have to go immediately. I was as if I was waiting for him to look at me and tell me, okay, now you have to go down because you're almost dying. I thought to my mind that I didn't come that far to go back. And then I made it. My message is for everyone who has felt pushed to the edge. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the hardships that individuals endure, whether women, minorities, the displaced, or disabled. No matter how high the mountain is, or no matter how hard the situation is, they can conquer that mountain in life. Believe me, if you give people the opportunity to be successful, they will. So, what dream will you dare to overcome?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Business Development Advisor for Medmark Insurance Brokerage Egypt and a 2013 George W. Bush Institute We Lead Scholar, Mariz.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm so honored to be back. 6 years ago on this stage, right before I left Dallas, I said, I have been transformed from being a dreamer to an achiever. If you allow me, I'm here today to share with you this journey of transformation. My time during the Women's Initiative was an eye-opener, helping me in 3 crucial areas. Exposure. I always say that without the Women's Initiative experience, I wouldn't have been able to do my current job, where I have to meet hundreds of clients. The program was essential in exposing us to key people from different backgrounds and in places of influence. Most of them were the top management of the most famous corporations in the US. The very fact that we had dinner hosted in the President of the United States place is not an everyday type of experience. And to that, of course, I'm very grateful. Networking, closely related to the idea of exposure. For the first time, I understood the concept of networking and how crucial it is to every area of life, be it the professional world, athletic world, or even daily interactions. I must say that I returned from the program with a totally different mindset than when I first walked in. I got to meet people coming from all walks of society and doing so many different things that I never even knew existed. And now I call them friends that I cherish and learn from. I must say that before the program, I was a very shy person. And it was difficult for me to network with people I've never met before. But thanks to the program, and in particular my role model, Charity, who never gave up on me, I learned how to effectively network with all kinds of people to the extent that people never believed that I was ever a shy person, which take us to the next level, and this is courage. The program did not only give me the courage to network and meet new people, but more importantly, the courage to pursue my dreams and to explore new places in life. I'm now able to go to places that I never thought possible. The program gave me a push to stretch my own limits in all life aspects, starting with running a 5K, to 10K, to many half marathons, and now I can go to a full marathon. But that wasn't enough. With sports as my passion, I have always wished to scale it and spread it in my own country. But it wasn't typical for women to practice sports publicly, with lots of taboos and stereotyping associated. So I teamed up with other passionate athletes, founding Cairo Runners, a committee that lead our nation to a big change in the mindset, availing sports, specifically running, for all classes, backgrounds, and ages. We started in 2012 with a tiny vision and number of runners, hesitantly running for the first time in our streets, having a dream that one day we have our own world-class Cairo Marathon in the heart of the city, which seemed impossible with all the obstacles we had back then. Seeing it happen, having over 6,000 runners taking over downtown Cairo after a long journey of trials, failures, more failures, and finally a big success. Today you can see youth, girls, and women running day and night confidently in the streets of Cairo, in neighborhoods where we avoided walking around before. The program allowed me to think beyond my own dream to a bigger vision that I can plan and accomplish. It allowed me to be a trendsetter rather than being a dreamer. The impact of my own transformation continued when I started being called for motivational speeches or youth coaching. One of my precious experiences was being invited as one of 4 main social influencers in Egypt to be a lead trainer at Elisa Sednawi Foundation, a place for creative learning, delivering mind and body workshop for children in Upper Egypt. Once you believe you are a go-getter, not only a dreamer, nothing stops you. Shortly, another long-awaited dream was due, which was reaching the top of Africa, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. It started off as a far-fetched dream and ended up as one invaluable experience, whipping off the word impossible from my dictionary. It takes courage, persistence, vision, action plans, and networking to be able to achieve our dreams. And that's exactly what happened to me. I can say that I gained a voice, I gained a new life. Whenever people think that I'm an extraordinary person, I answer them that I'm a regular person who was gifted an extraordinary opportunity of courage, exposure, and networking. Your support and investment in this program change lives and impact nations on so many levels. I'm forever grateful for the Bush Institute. Keep changing people's lives. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen,